don't really understand why. And so today we're going to talk about parents and parental rights and children and education. We're going to have some guests that are actively involved here in New Hampshire, dealing with the issues that are impacting you and your family. And hopefully we'll have some questions from you about for Vivek as he listens to some of the experts here on the ground and wants to hear from all of you. And I think that's what Americans really want right now. We want leaders who want to learn from the very smart people of America, who are living and working and make this country so incredibly special. So I appreciate Vivek being willing to sit and listen and to take questions and to hear from all of you. So we're going to say the Pledge of Allegiance to start. I tried to cajole some of my friends here to help me to do that. But I will, if we could stand for a moment. Thank you. And we will say the pledge. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. So Vivek Ramaswamy is here. Vivek, why don't you join us? Nice to see you. Good. So why don't we sit for a second, Vivek? Let's make sure your mic is working.
Sure. How's this sound?
Sounds good. Sounds good. So, Vivek, you said you wanted to talk about parents and parental rights, and the last time I saw you was at CPAC.
That's right.
Yeah, and we did a little interview, and we talked about some of the different issues that are happening across the country, and then I said, Vivek, we have this parent pledge at Moms for Liberty, and would you be willing to sign the parent pledge? And he said, oh, well, let me see it. And so Marie, who works with me, brought the pledge over and put it in front of Vivek, and you read it, and what did you say, Vivek?
I said this was the easiest pledge I've been asked to sign. Normally I'm supposed to ask people to read this through from every legal angle. This is just too easy. I signed it on the spot. I was proud to become the first signatory amongst the presidential candidates of the Moms for Liberty pledge, and I want to congratulate you guys for being so clear-eyed about what you are doing for families across this country. The easiest thing I could do is sign it, so thank you all for what you do. Really grateful for it.
So let's talk about, for a second, fundamental parental rights, because that's what the pledge says. The pledge says that you, as a candidate or an elected official, will work to support legislation and will work to uphold fundamental parental rights. And you're a dad, right?
I am.
Okay, so tell me a little bit about your family quickly.
So I was raised in a two-parent household with a focus on education and a belief in God. That's the ultimate privilege that I enjoyed as a kid growing up in this country. And it's a privilege that we should extend to more children who grow up in this country as well. So our first role in doing that starts not as a politician, but starts as a parent. I now have two sons at home. One's 3 years old, one's 11 months old. They travel with me on the campaign trail from time to time. We're doing this as a family. And I think the number one thing that I think about now as they're of entering school age, my older one, is that we as the parents determine the education of our children. That's a hard truth in America. We do not want the federal government involved in education at all. That's why as a presidential candidate, I've been very clear, as the first one to say it, I will abolish the U.S. Department of Education, which should have never existed in the first place. But at the same time, we as conservatives, I think that, and I hope we talk about this in more depth today, I want to see us graduate from just running from something and to see us start running to something. And so, yes, we're against big government. I'm against the U.S. Department of Education. $90 billion spent using our taxpayer money that should have been spent. But we're also for the nuclear family, the best known form of governance to mankind. And I think the more we're talking about not just what we're against, but what we are for truth. We are for the individual. And yes, we are for the family itself. That's actually what leads us to then what becomes obvious, because then we're educating our children. The nuclear family is the form of governance. Yes, parents are the ones who determine the education of their children. And I think that's our path forward.
So you may have heard that Moms for Liberty, the organization that I helped to found, and we have some Moms for Liberty in the audience. We were named by the Southern Poverty Law Center a couple days ago a hate group, an extremist group. We were labeled as anti-government. So as a dad of two, a father, a husband, what do you think about the SPLC naming a group of concerned moms an extremist group?
So I can say a word about this organization, actually, as the SPLC. I actually wrote about it in my first book, Woke Inc. And I would love to tell you that I was shocked to see such a preposterous designation applied to an honorable organization doing good work in this country. But
thank you.
The sad state of affairs is that I'm not surprised. I say that SPLC it's really a corrupt organization where it was founded to take on the KKK. But today there is no relevant KKK. So once an organization's achieved its purpose, what should it do? It should actually just disband and move on. It should have been a task force rather than a perpetual body. Instead, it creates new enemies that fulfill its own need for continued existence. So this is a group that has over $300 million on its balance sheet. Now, here's an interesting question to ask, because this is the part that actually matters. You want to get to the heart of how the game is played. Beyond the talking points, let's get real. The people who fund the Southern Poverty Law Center are sitting in this room, actually. Turns out, we don't know it, but our 401k accounts, our retirement accounts, are invested in America's public companies. Turns out America's public companies, like Apple, which made a 7-figure donation to the Southern Poverty Law Center, or Pfizer, or JP Morgan, or Bank of America, or MGM, I could go on, are making big donations to a nonprofit that browbeats those same CEOs into submission. I don't know if all of you are familiar with my background. I'm not a politician. I never run for office. I've had success in the world of business. That was my background before I wrote Woke Inc., which then, through a series of steps, led to the journey that I'm on now. I know the CEOs of many of these companies. They don't agree personally with the agendas or the blackmail tactics used by the Southern Poverty Law Center, and yet they're still using their money, which is really our money, to advance that agenda. You want to know why? Because they don't have courage. The Southern Poverty Law Center is also now providing the blueprint used by even the police state, like the FBI, which collaborates with the SPLC. So funny enough, a couple days ago, there was a former FBI agent on MSNBC that said he was glad that the SPLC actually was designating Moms for Liberty and other parental rights organizations as hate groups. That's the same FBI that sits under the current Attorney General who designated concerned parents across this country to be domestic terrorists. So that's how this game is played. It's this merger of state power and private power, corporate power, to together do what neither could do on its own. But the greasing of the wheels takes place by these invisible nonprofits. And the reason I want to thank you guys, to thank Moms for Liberty, the reason I'm proud to be here, is that you exhibit something that actually the CEOs of the biggest companies in this country do not, which is courage. Courage means that you have convictions and that you're willing to make a sacrifice, to take a risk, to act on those convictions. Think about that. Yes, being put on an FBI-approved list by a nonprofit, being designated as a hate group, yeah, that comes with some risk. It involves some sacrifice. Let's be honest about that. But we can make those sacrifices. You are making those sacrifices because you know what you're sacrificing for.
And our
That's
kids
the future of our
and
country.
our children are watching us. We are joyful
Yes.
warriors. We say at Moms for Liberty, our children are watching us. We're modeling the behavior that we want to see from them. It was interesting. I had to tell my daughter, I was on Fox last night with Harris Faulkner and talking about this issue. And my kids are somewhat shielded from a lot of what I do. But my daughter's 18. And I said, hey, Ava, I just want to let you know I'm going to be on TV tonight. And I need to talk about this, that we've been named a hate group. And she's like, what do you mean you've been named a hate group? And so I said, Southern Poverty Law Center. And she's, of course, on her phone, typing it, looking it up. And she's like, Mom, they have you next to the United Skinhead Nation. She's like, this is so ridiculous. And I'm like, well, you know what? I've inoculated the 18-year-olds, right?
Well, exactly. I mean, at the end of the day, truth actually wins. I think that we have to, as adults, as parents, as leaders in this country, have the courage to speak what we put on that back sign right there, truth. That is what this country was founded on, is the actual truth. And you all have the courage to actually stand up. We have the courage. So I'll tell you, if you're a hate group, count me in. And we can take that actually as a badge of honor for where we are today as a country, for the same reasons as using a voter ID law is labeled racist. It's a sad state of affairs. The closer you are to being called racist, the more likely it is that you're actually doing the right thing. Well, now we've come full circle to see that if you're being designated by a corrupt government or its nonprofit cronies in the private sector, like the Southern Poverty Law Center, as a hate group, probably means that you're actually on the side of speaking truth itself. And I think that this is something that, as you all know, I'm in this Republican race for U.S. president, okay? I'm the first millennial ever to run for president as a Republican, all right? I have a responsibility to reach that next generation that is starved for truth. Your kid's generation, my kid's generation. Let's start talking about truth. What is true? We don't talk about these things anymore. God is real. There are two genders. Fossil fuels are a requirement for human prosperity. Reverse racism is racism. An open border is no border. Parents determine the education of their children. You want to talk about the nuclear family, the best known form of governance to mankind. Capitalism lifts people up from poverty. There are 3 branches of government, not 4, the one the FBI sits in. And the U.S. Constitution is the strongest guarantor of freedoms in U.S. history and in world history. That is truth. And we have to stand for truth without apology, because that is who we are. And if we're not willing to model that behavior for our kids, then I don't know who will.
So we're going to have some guests join us in a minute. Just quickly, parental rights, such a threat, right? We're seen, I think it's really interesting. The family seen as such a threat. Parents have been speaking out. We've seen them speaking out, but they've been shut down at almost every turn, right? Mics cut off, right? Labels placed, all of these things. Why are parental rights such a threat, Vivek?
Well, families are a threat. You're right. You want to know, Karl Marx actually viewed the nuclear family structure as a threat to a communist order, because that's a different ordering of a society than centrally doing it from the state on down. It's the same reason why even a couple of years ago, to tell you a little bit about my story, I was a biotech CEO. I was running a company. We developed medicines. One of them is a life-saving medicine for kids. That was the path I was on. And then suddenly George Floyd dies, and then there's a demand on my desk to make a statement on behalf of Black Lives Matter. And when I went to their website, the thing that I learned is actually what led me out of my path as a biotech CEO, was that this was an organization that called for dismantling the nuclear family structure. So you don't call for dismantling something unless it presents a threat to you. What is that threat? It says that there's a different way we order our structure in society. Yes, we all need structure. I think that we as individuals don't exist as atomistic mammals roaming some common geographic space. We need order. That much is true. The other side, our side, I think we can agree on that. The question is, who provides that order? Is it the families? Or is it the state? And as I come back to, the reason we're against big government is because we know we could talk about it in the Christian tradition, we could talk about it in the Hindu tradition, we could talk about it in Aristotle's tradition. time tested across time and space, the family unit is the foundation for any flourishing society. That is why it's a threat, because it's a substitute. It says there's an alternative to the state to educate our children. There's an alternative to the state for how we actually prosper. And anyone who's insecure in their own value proposition is always threatened by an alternative. Well, I think the overreaching state is always insecure in its own value proposition, and that is why it's threatened by the alternative. That is the family, and that is why we will not apologize for it.
Excellent answer. Thank you, Vivek. So we're going to invite two guests now to join us, and they're going to talk a little bit about education and parental rights in New Hampshire. First, we have Anne Marie Banfield and Richard Lehman joining us. Anne Marie is an education and policy expert here in New Hampshire, and Richard is an attorney who acts as the Senate attorney, but is in private practice. And we got to chat a little bit backstage and talk about some of the things happening in New Hampshire. And now we're going to talk all together about it. Anne Marie, I'm going to give you an opportunity for a second just to introduce yourself. I know you probably know some of the people in the room because I know you've had such an amazing impact on education here in New Hampshire and helping parents. So please, take a few minutes.
Sure. So I'm a mom, and probably, well, all my kids are now grown, but years ago when they were starting school, I decided I was going to start researching education for selfish purposes for my kids. And since then, I have acquired quite a bit of knowledge, as I think some of you know. And so I help parents in this state in terms of how to deal with mainly the school system. And I also lobby at the State House. And by the way, I've never received any compensation in 20 years of doing this. I want to make that clear because I've been accused of being a paid lobbyist. I'm not. I do this because it's the right thing to do. And so I lobby on legislation, and oftentimes I'm the only one in the room lobbying against a lot of people who are against parents or against excellence in education in public schools. And so I testify on bills. I will help anyone. I don't care who is running for office. I will help them understand the issue, and because you'd be amazed at what most people don't know, and it's tough. It's a big issue. It's a difficult issue, and so I've been doing this for many years, and I'm happy to help any parents free of charge if I can help them, or I direct them to somebody else, like my colleague next to me.
And it was so wonderful to hear how you two are working together. And so, Richard, take a few minutes, introduce yourself, tell us about your role in New Hampshire in private practice, but then also with the legislature.
Sure. My name's Rick Lehman. I am, as she said, a lawyer in private practice in Concord with the firm Lehman Major List. We do a general practice law firm with some specialties in employment and education law. I have a partner who's, in my mind, the foremost gun rights lawyer in the state of New Hampshire. And we generally approach things from the right side of the aisle because the legal community is mostly dominated by people not like us. And when they come to us, people who are like-minded know they're going to be hearing from somebody who's approaches the world sees the world the way they do. So it builds a sort of an instant trust. I've also, for 17 of the last 22 years, served as the legal counsel to the state Senate. It's been my privilege to do that. I need to be very clear with everybody that I'm here in my private capacity. I'm not speaking for the Senate or anybody in it right now. I do see here in the audience former Senate President, my good friend Chuck Morris, who I'm glad to see today. And that has just been a great privilege for me over the years. I was a newcomer to New Hampshire 30 years ago, and being able to do that has really brought me into the sort of the joys that this state offers all the people who live here, the opportunities to be involved at very high levels if you really want to put in the elbow grease and do the work to participate, and just a great opportunity and a lot of joy. So that's my story.
So we're going to jump right in. We're not going to waste any time. We're going to talk to Rick. Do you want me to call you Rick?
Yes,
Is that
please.
good?
That's
all right.
great.
We're going to talk to Rick about a case that I don't know how many of you are aware of, but I'm guessing quite a few, and it's not a lone case across the United States. We are seeing that schools are keeping secrets from parents. Keeping secrets from parents. So, Rick, tell us about the case currently that is before your Supreme Court that you're waiting to hear a ruling on right now.
Sure. Anne Marie contacted me with a woman who had encountered a situation with her child. It was during COVID when classes were happening online, so she was able to sort of peer into the classroom and for the first time see what was really going on, like a lot of parents during that time. And this mother realized that the school was treating her child as being of a different gender than the mother understood her child to be. And nobody had asked her if that was okay. Nobody had provided any kind of notification. Nobody had said a word to her. And as soon as she found out that this was the case, she emailed the first teacher at the school, and the first teacher at the school and told the teachers, this is not what I think is best for my child. And the first teacher said, oh, I agree. If you're not in support of this, then I don't think we should be doing that. And the second teacher she contacted said the same thing, and about 5 minutes later she got an email from the principal in the building where the child was in middle school that said, I'm sorry, we have this policy in schools, this is in Manchester, we're required to treat the child however the child wants to be treated, and when we contact you, we're not going to let on that we're treating the child that way. The policy specifically says that in school, we're going to treat the child how the child wants to be treated, but when we communicate with the parent, we're going to revert back to using the name and pronouns that the parent understood the case to be. We filed a lawsuit saying that that violated the parent's constitutional rights. The Superior Court said, no, it doesn't. We appealed to the Supreme Court. We have the cases pending in the Supreme Court. We've had briefing and oral argument. During the oral argument, one of the most appalling things about the whole case was that the school district's lawyer said, well, if you don't like it, you can go to another school. That's your parental right, is to withdraw from the public school that you're required to attend unless you can arrange some other situation. And your parental rights begin and end with your choice to send the kid to public school or not.
Well, at Moms for Liberty, we say parental rights do not stop at the classroom door. Want to get your thoughts on this, Vivek, and then I want Anne Marie to tell you a little bit about something called JBAB, Just Be a Buddy. That in 20, let's talk about that a little bit.
So my first reaction to that case is that it is actually the silver lining in it is the best argument for school choice. Because if that's the backstop to say that your only option is the opt-out, then there is no argument for making sure that argument against the idea that parents should have the financial ability to opt out. So I believe in every tragic story, and that is a tragic story, actually.
I'll let you down a little
There's
secret,
silver lining
though.
on the back of that.
The same people who support the policy are against the school
I
choice.
bet you, exactly. And that comes as no surprise, right? Because it's sort of the pyramid of hypocrisies. Now, here's the other thing here's another hypocrisy at the heart of that. Part of the argument for the so-called trans empathy movement, the one that's actually creating more gender dysphoria in our schools. It's like you can measure in COVID-19, they use this number, the R squared. It's how quickly a virus spreads. Well, actually, it turns out this is like epidemic level proportions when in a classroom, one kid identifies as being a gender different than their biological sex. That spreads faster in the classroom than COVID-19. So if this is a mental health condition that is such a source of suffering, why in our schools are we going out of our way to create more of it? That's part of what's underlying that dilemma. And then there's the piece that you mentioned, which is hiding it from the parents, because that's what the heart of that case is about. And part of the argument, and this part, there's truth to it. Children who believe that they're born in the wrong body, that their gender doesn't match their biological sex, that means they're suffering from a mental health condition. Transgenderism is a mental health condition. And it is true that there's a higher rate of suicide and self-harm amongst these kids. That's the whole argument for why there was more empathy needed in the classroom. Yet, why would it be that for a condition where there's a greater likelihood of self-harm among that kid, that you otherwise wouldn't let the parent know about that very risk. So the contradictions abound. It actually has very little to do with empathy or compassion. The compassionate thing to do to a kid isn't to affirm their cruelty and to do it in hiding. That's not compassion, that's cruelty. But it is a form of cruelty that's a way of exerting, I think, a lot of power and dominion and control and punishment. That's really what this agenda is about. And I think a lot of parents today are left being on the receiving end of that power, dominion, control, and punishment. And thanks to you and thanks to your hard work as well, we're not going to stand by quietly and watch that happen.
So we're going to talk to Anne Marie now. Anne Marie is the OG mama bear, right, in there fighting.
Yes.
So Anne Marie, we're talking about classrooms. We're talking about secrets being kept from children. New Hampshire, you had a Parents' Bill of Rights that went past your Senate, I believe, and didn't pass the House. It's not the first time it's been brought. Last year, it lost by 5 votes. This year, by 8 votes. Let's just talk a little bit about fundamental parental rights in New Hampshire. Why can we not get a Parents' Bill of Rights passed here? What's going on?
Parental rights has become a partisan issue, and it's sad. It's really sad, and I'm really disappointed, but Democrats are against parental rights, and they have shown it in terms of legislation and how they vote, not just this bill, but other bills that I have been part of getting passed in this state. And I've had them oppose me just on some basic legislation. And, it's interesting because you brought up the school choice thing. I can tell you that they're doing more to help the school choice movement than any Republican could be doing. Honestly.
Absolutely.
What they are doing in public schools right now is driving so many families out of the public schools. And my focus in this state has always been, how do we improve the public schools so parents aren't forced to remove their kids? Because they're paying a lot of taxes, and a lot of times they cannot put their kids in another school, or they cannot homeschool because maybe they need two parents, or maybe it's a single parent working. So my focus has been, let's find ways to improve our public schools. And every time I turn a corner, and and Senator Morris can attest to this, I'm trying to do things to improve public education. I am smacked down. I mean, we are smacked down at every turn, and the parental rights bill is just one that is well known. There's other bills that have been opposed that would support parents and support public education that they have opposed. So I'm afraid it's just become a partisan issue, and I don't know why, and I think that we need to talk to our legislators. I mean, I called my state rep about the parental rights bill, and he is a Democrat. We talked for half an hour, and he's a nice guy. He did vote against it. Obviously, it didn't work. But, we had a long conversation. I think what we need to do is we need to start talking again to these people. We need to converse with them. We need to talk to them. And then we need to fund and we need to support those who stand up for parental rights. We cannot sit on the sidelines. You cannot sit on the sidelines anymore. Even if you don't have kids. By the way, my kids aren't in public schools. And I do this. And I've been doing it for 20 years. And because look at your property tax bill. Take a look at what you're paying for your public school. Since when shouldn't you have a voice? You should be going to your school board meetings and saying, I want better for our schools, because parents need you. Those parents need you. This parent needs you at those school board meetings saying, this isn't acceptable. Manchester School still has that policy in place, the JBAB policy. That JBAB policy is in this district. You're in District 16, where you are sitting right now, Brentwood.
JBAB, so let's just stop for a second.
Sure.
Just be a buddy. In 2015, 2016, the New Hampshire School Board Association decided they were going to write some model policy. I'm sure they got it from somewhere, right? And it said, I'm not going to read the complete language to you, but basically that schools should and could keep secrets from parents regarding gender transition. Just be a buddy. Be an ally, right?
When was this, you said?
This was in 2015, 2016.
2015,
Yep.
interesting. Okay.
Yep.
So, Anne Marie, just be a buddy means keep secrets from parents?
Right. Not only that, in JBAB policy, and some schools have revised it. Some schools have a different policy, or maybe they don't have it at all. But SAU 16 does have it verbatim, of course, and they can use the bathroom that they gender identify with. They can play on the opposite sports team, and so we have a great group of parents here, and they've done a lot in this district, but they need more help, and that's what we need to do. We need to make sure that we are getting good people on the school board. But this policy itself was never adopted in Bedford. And some of the school districts, like I said, changed some of it so it's not as offensive to parents. But you've got to be involved. This is your money. This is your taxes going to pay for this.
Marie, let me ask you just a quick question from my understanding. You did say it's become a partisan issue, and I agree with you, and it shouldn't be. As I understand it, we have Republican majorities here and a Republican governor as well. I'd like to better understand, it's one thing to talk about a state where you have split control, but this isn't one of those states. And so I'd like to understand, what opposition did you hear from the Republicans who ended up coming out on the other side of this issue?
There was only a few. There was only a couple. So the majority of them supported the parental rights bill. The few that did not, I have to tell you, I was a little confused by the reasoning. The Constitution and privacy rights. I said, wait a second, privacy from whom? Yes. Child has privacy rights from their parents? And that was one of the biggest reasons, is that they felt that keeping this information from parents was okay. And I said, if you're standing on the Constitution, because that's what they were standing on, then how is the state, the government, you're supporting the government keeping secrets from parents? It just didn't make any sense to me. There's no logic in it. It's one thing if you're fighting the state, but to take the state side against parents didn't make sense to me, because you're supposed to be sticking up for us and pushing back the government.
Anne Marie has it exactly right. They have it exactly backwards.
Yep. Yeah.
Children and families do have privacy rights, and those privacy operate as a family unit vis-a-vis the school and the government, not where the government wraps its loving arms around some young teen and offers privacy against parents knowing what their children are up to.
I think there's a deep concept here so there's a concept in the criminal law. They use a Latin word for it, mens rea, refers to the state of mind. Right? That's what converts something that's just a bad act that you could be sued for by a private party into a crime that you can be prosecuted for, is you have a state of mind. So how do they figure out whether you have a bad state of mind? Is one of the things you do is you cover it up. So anytime, that's why people get caught for the cover-up, not for the actual commission of the act. There's a parallel here where the schools in the first place were actually responsible for the indoctrination that is creating and contributing to this epidemic of gender dysphoria across the country. But it's not an accident that that's exactly the same set of schools at the same point in time, which now want to effectively put up the barricade to hide that fact. And so I think that the idea of keeping this from the parents, as illogical as it sounds, I think is linked to the fact that it's actually starting in the schools in the first place. And it's my hope, most Democrats, most of us in this room probably have Democrat friends who have parents, who have children.
We have members who are Democrats who are parents who have children.
I have a Democratic parent.
There you go.
So there you go. A simple fact is, an observation is that most of them live their lives as parents, not as politicians, but as parents in a way that are consistent with the values we're talking about right here. So we're often told to say, practice what you preach, but I hope we can start teaching some of these parents who also happen to be legislators to start preaching what they practice. Because this isn't the way that they would want their own family operating. It's not the way they raise their kids or live their lives. We have this disconnect between what people are actually willing to say in the home, in private, and the way they run their private lives. But sometimes there's something about showing up in public. Maybe it's because the Southern Poverty Law Center is going to designate you a hate group.
Right, yeah.
But I think that culture of fear is part of what creates this disconnect. And so my hope is more of them will come around to speaking in the way that they actually conduct their own private lives and family lives at home.
So that's a great point, and thank you for that. And I think you're right, but I think, part of it is unifying, right? It's holding up that torch of liberty and freedom and bringing people around you and saying, this is what I stand for, and people say, oh, you too? Mm-hmm. Right? And then people come together.
Exactly. I mean, I think that fear has become infectious in our culture. If you want to ask me, what is the best metric of America's civic health? It's not the number of ballots we cast every November. That's just the final act at the end of the process. The best measure of the health of American democracy is the percentage of people who feel free to say what they actually think in public. And I can't remember a time in my life where there has been a bigger gap between what people will say in public and what they'll say in private. The government's not going to solve that. We shouldn't want the government. I say this as someone running for U.S. president. This is not something we should look to the government to solve. You know where we look for solving this? We look in the mirror. We look inside. The way we close that gap is all of us starting to talk openly again. That's why I love Moms for Liberty. Organizations like you all, because it takes, but it does take, you guys have formed a group to do it. And so fear is infectious, but I actually think courage can be contagious too. It just takes more people willing to exhibit it together. And then you kind of hit an activation energy, and that starts a domino effect of its own. And that's what I think we're in the middle of seeing across this country, thanks to work like what both of you were doing as well. Continuing to talk about that case, talk about your experience. I'm confident that next time around, and it's a little bit of time before the next session as I understand it, that bill should fly straight through because I think the cultural conditions in this country will have changed. But it's not going to happen automatically. It's going to happen because I'm not going to let you all off the hook that easily either. It's not someone coming from on high to save us, none of us up here. It's going to be because we save ourselves. But when you're the only person in the room who believes what you do, you have an obligation now more than ever to stand up and actually say it. And the more you do it, I think the more you will discover, and Marie, this is the point you were getting at, the more you will discover that you actually weren't the only person in the room who believes what you did. So, thank you.
So you're running for United States president. You would like to abolish the Department of Education. So let's talk about, your vision for education in America. Something that Anne-Marie and I were discussing that's really important. Here in New Hampshire, there are no surveys that are allowed to be given. Parents have to opt in and allow their children to take surveys except for one. And that is the CDC Youth at Risk Survey. And Anne-Marie, I'm going to give her a second to just give us a little background about that and to tell us, talk about funding our own demise here in America, right? You talk a little bit about 401ks and all of the things that are happening. Here we have the CDC, basing a lot of the actions they'd like to take in America's public schools on this survey. So Anne-Marie, can you tell us a little bit about why the CDC survey is the accepted survey? We do not give it in Florida anymore. School districts have been opting out left and right.
Oh, very nice.
But required here, Anne-Marie. Yeah. So let us know a little bit about that.
So many years ago, I actually lived in Bedford before we moved to the seacoast. We had the surveys given to students in the school. And a letter was sent home, your kid's going to take a survey, it's no big deal, don't worry about it, parents, they're going to take a survey, it's all good. And then their kids came home and started telling their parents what was on the survey, and it was explicit, sex, and it wasn't just questions about, sex, it was when you have sex to a 12-year-old. This is the kind of questions that they asked. So it wasn't even like do you. It was when you. There was all kinds of things, drugs, alcohol.
Let's just clarify here.
Yeah.
When you have sex, have you, excuse me, and I'll little ears, but have you been under the influence of different things? Have you been under the influence of this? Have you been under, and to give it to 12-year-olds.
Yeah. Gender
Right?
identity, all kinds of questions, all kinds of things that were very bothersome to parents. So we decided that it was time to get parental consent on these surveys, and we were going to do it on all non-academic surveys. But if you worked with the legislature, you know that sometimes you have to compromise. We couldn't get it through the way we wanted. We had to exempt the CDC survey in order to get the law passed. And we got the law passed. And then just a few years ago, we tried to get the CDC survey back in as one that would require parental consent, but we just couldn't get that one through either. So that is the exception right now. The problem with it too is, for instance, I had a parent. I just got to be mindful of children in the room. There's a lot of things on these surveys that kids learn that are not good, and I can't talk about it in this setting, but kids learn how to use substances sometimes from these surveys. Sniffing, I'll just say that. And so when you ask that question, then kids go, "Oh, really? I can do that, and I can get high off of that." And so that's the problem. And what happens is, I'm going to these hearings and I'm telling these, legislators that, we need parental consent on this. For instance, questions on suicide. I had a parent who was very concerned that her daughter would become, or maybe her kids would become fascinated, or, these things happen depending on children. So these are the kinds of things that I go to the hearing and I say we need parental consent, but all these lobbyists come in who are receiving grant money, who are receiving money, who need the results of the survey. They need the results to sustain what they're doing, because now they take the results and they say, "Oh, look, we have an uptick in drug usage." And quite frankly, these kids will tell you that they fill it out and they joke. They don't even answer it honestly, but whatever. So they're using that to justify their position and bringing programs into the school. So that's all about money for them. It's all about getting money from the grant organizations and coming into the schools. But so that's why that one is exempted. I would love to get that one, parental right or parental consent. That one you do have to notify the parent on. But we even had, I think, in Hollis Brookline where the school administered the survey and didn't even notify the parents. So a lot of schools aren't even following the law.
So Vivek, you talk about the chain of money a lot.
Yep.
A few
right?
schools.
I
Sorry.
bet.
I'm sorry.
That doesn't surprise me.
CDC, big overreach during COVID, right? Lots of recommendations being made, not a regulatory agency, yet recommendations being taken as law and mandates. What do you think about when you hear that, right? That parents don't have, we have a federal law, the People Protection Rights Act, right, that says that surveys can't be given. So as president, what actions will you take to try to rein in some of these groups?
So I'm going to be very honest with you. I think there's a lot of Republicans for a long time who have been making promises to reform the administrative state. I think if we're being really honest about ourselves, we cannot tame that beast. But we do have an option. We can actually shut it down. There are 3 branches of government, not 4, enshrined in the U.S. Constitution. When you have an agency that continues to exist as long as you put the CDC in this category, you put the Department of Education in this category, you put the FBI in this category as well. They like to wrap them in 3 letters. The culture of that agency becomes this. They think they're the ones actually responsible for making policy, and the people who we elect, people like me, who's running for the White House, people who occupy that position, we're just cute little inconveniences that come and go every 4 or 8 years. I was here long before you arrive, and I'll be here long after you're gone. That's the mentality. So I think that I come at this as an outsider. I'm not a professional politician. I've run a business before. I've run multiple businesses. My view, and here's my understanding of Article 2 of the Constitution, is that if somebody works for you and you cannot fire them, that means they do not work for you. It means you work for them because you're responsible for what they do, but without having any authority to change it. So what am I going to do? I believe the U.S. president is empowered by the Constitution to run the executive branch, not the branches. There is one executive branch. And so I believe I am constitutionally empowered, as if I'm elected as the president, to take an administrative agency for which there was no reason of existence in the first place, and to actually end it as a managerial matter. So that includes the Department of Education. Shut that down, the $90 billion in total, effectively, that's spent through that agency. That more than covers underfunded gaps in school choice across the country. You have a lot left over. 25% of that could be used to put 3 armed security guards in every school across this country. That's just a quarter of that budget. Think about what's a better use of money. It's not even close. Funding, by the way, 4-year degrees to be a gender studies major in California without doing a thing for somebody who wants to pursue a vocational degree, to be a plumber or a mechanic or a welder. That's on the Department of Education, but the CDC is the same problem. This is an agency that is broken beyond repair. It behaves like a regulatory agency, even though it was never supposed to be one. And so it's this theory of the Constitution. It's called the unitary theory of the executive. It sounds scary, but really complicated. It's not. It just says that there's one executive branch, not 2. And so part of the problem is in the budgeting process. You're talking about the flow of money you were alluding to. Part of the problem is the budgeting process, where the way it was supposed to work, the way our founding fathers envisioned it, the way it worked for most of our history, was that the executive branch, the White House, asked for permission on how to spend money. So the budget allocations, the budget appropriations used to come back from Congress saying the executive branch may spend X on a said purpose. Presidents started to get lazy over time, especially with the birth and proliferation of the administrative state. So they said, hey, you guys talk to Congress and work it out for yourselves. So then the deep state started to say, okay, well, we'll just put up the draft language that says, no. It'll come back and say, you shall spend it. So that's what they send over as drafts to Congress. Congress is mostly asleep at the switch anyway. They don't read the legislation they pass. And that slowly started to become the language of budget appropriations in this country. What used to come back to say we may spend up to this started to come back and say we shall spend this. So then say you have a president like Trump that shows up and wants to drain the swamp and says, all right, we're going to do this. The thing the deep state comes back and says, the 3-letter regulatory state, 3-letter agencies, CDC to Department of Education, is that, well, Mr. President, Congress has mandated that you spend it. Congress says in the appropriations right here, you shall spend X. So even if you don't want to, you have to, and it feels like the president's hands are tied. I refuse to govern that way. So the budget requests will run through the White House. Who would have ever thought? Where the people actually vested authority to run the executive branch of the government. So it requires getting into the details a little bit. Thank you. But the details actually matter, and that's exactly how we're going to reform this beast. We're not going to tame it. We will shut it down.
Great. So I don't know how much time we have, so if someone from your team could just give me a little heads up. I've got a couple more things to talk about with you. Specifically, let's talk about DEI. Yes. I've learned today it's not DEI in New Hampshire. Did you know that the officers in the schools are called DEIJ officers?
Oh, I didn't know that. This is new to me.
Yeah.
What's the J?
The J is...
Justice,
which is my last name, so I'm partial. But we've got schools spending here in New Hampshire upwards of $180,000 a year, I have been told, for DEIJ officers in schools. That's a lot of money. It's more than twice, Rick told me, than what teachers are making here in New Hampshire. And so, Rick, can you tell us a little bit about the non-discrimination in education law here, and then some of the things that are still happening in the schools? And then, Vivek, I know this is an issue of great passion for you and importance, and I'd love for you guys to hear you guys talk a little bit about some of the ways that you think there's some solutions going forward.
Excellent.
Sure. New Hampshire, a couple years ago, passed a Non-Discrimination in Education Act based loosely on a national model for keeping politics out of schools. And it basically says in public schools, teachers aren't supposed to teach that any racial, sex, gender, religion, nationality, any of those sort of protected classes groups are inherently superior to any other, are inherently oppressive toward another group, should be discriminated against because of membership in that group, or should not attempt to treat members of different groups as being fully equal. That strikes me as just basic human decency. I mean, I can't imagine a world in which we would encourage people to treat each other as being inherently superior or inferior or inherently different, frankly, in any of those ways. That law is now subject to challenge in the federal court over in Concord. One of the plaintiffs, by the way, is the DEIJ director here in the school district, is one of the plaintiffs in that lawsuit. They are claiming that the existence of that law puts them in a position where they're not quite sure what they're allowed to say or not say when they're teaching in a public school classroom. So the claim is we don't really understand what it means to do any of those things, even though I think that the record's pretty clear, and I think that anybody who's spending time looking at it understands that that's the backbone of critical race theory, or those sort of four pillars. And the law that was passed here in New Hampshire was an attempt to try and keep that stuff out of our schools in favor of the things that I think most of us learned when we were kids growing up, is that you should treat everybody equally, no matter what they look like, no matter where they come from, no matter how they choose to worship God. All those things, we're all equal in those regards, and I think most of us believe that. But just like the family unit and parental rights apparently present a threat to some of the power structures in these schools, our belief in equality and presents the same kind of threat, is how I surmise it. And so that case is pending in court, and we're going to see how it turns out.
And we're seeing those kinds of cases litigated against those laws across the country. My concern about it was actually different than the court cases. It's that, and here I'm going to use the language, I don't often talk about the right and the left, just because those terms are often meaningless, but here I'm going to use the word the left, is actually masterful at playing verbal jujitsu. So even if you say, that's critical race theory, well, we got Schmidtical race theory now, right? It'll constantly
culturally
evolve.
Responsive teaching.
Right,
Same
exactly.
acronym.
Exactly. That's it. They'll make the acronym mean something new, so it's like viral evolution. It's a virus, but it evolves with mutations to stay just ahead, but to keep and becoming equally infectious. So I'm looking at this, obviously, from a vantage point, if we all look at how we're going to drive our version of change. I'm looking at this through what a U.S. president can do. And my view is that the laws that are already on the books actually give us a pretty good toolkit to work with if we get to the essence of what's going on with the DEI, or recently DEIJ, agenda. So stay with me here. I like New Hampshire because we can get into the details with you guys, and I enjoy getting into the details, actually. We can't just stick to the talking points and slogans. How are we actually going to get this done? So for the budgetary discussion we just had to this one. So it relates to the civil rights laws. The civil rights laws prohibit discrimination on axes of race, gender, religion, national origin. Let's talk about religion. So I personally think that the civil rights laws have been overexpansively interpreted for a very long time in ways that have led us down this rabbit hole. And we can talk about that. Race has been expansively interpreted to mean that actually you can't create a hostile work environment for someone who's of a certain race. And how do you create a hostile work environment is basically saying that anybody in a protected class disagrees with. So that creates the conditions for viewpoint discrimination while leaving viewpoints unprotected, which is why I said if I had to pass a law, I would make political viewpoints a civil right. But what I'm going to talk about doesn't require the passage of a law. As the president, I'll direct the Department of Justice to enforce the religion prong of the civil rights statutes, because that prong, as it's been interpreted, says that not only does it mean that you can't discriminate on the basis of an employee's religion. Say, take a teacher here. So I'm going to move from students to teachers as the focus. But it also means that you as the employer cannot force your employees to bow down to the religion of the employer. So that raises the question of whether the modern DEIJ agenda meets the Supreme Court's test for what counts as a religion. Turns out it meets the Supreme Court's test to a T. It's a comprehensive worldview. There are certain words you can't say, clothes you can't wear, apologies you must recite. Secular humanism has been deemed to meet the Supreme Court's test for what counts as a religion for Title VII purposes. Well, if secular humanism meets that definition, then certainly the modern woke agenda in the form of DEI meets that test as well. So I've written legal articles about this. It's an extensive chapter dedicated to it in Woke Inc. But when I'm looking at this as a U.S. president, this is where I don't want to play the semantic games of the new law, because then they're just going to mutate and stay one step ahead. It's just one example. We know it to be wrong, right? This quasi-religious indoctrination with a particular philosophy that if you don't bend the knee, you might lose your job or get a bad grade. We know innately there's something wrong with it. What's the chance that that was somehow existing and legal under the existing laws of the country? The answer is they're not. And so one of the ways we, I think, get to solutions in this country, and I'll lead accordingly if I'm elected as the next president, is to apply the civil rights laws themselves even-handedly. I didn't like protected classes in the first place, but so long as we're going to have them, we will apply those standards even-handedly. And that avoids the tangles of going through the process of new legislation to actually go after something that was itself a violation of the laws as they stood. And I think that's how we take our movement forward, is we don't need to reinvent the wheel. We have the wheel that already got us as far as we did.
That's a great answer. Thank you for sharing that. I want to take an opportunity. We want to ask some questions now. We want to hear from you. So I want everyone to think right now. What do you have? You have any questions for Vivek? You have any questions for our panel? I want to take an opportunity to thank Pastor Cook. Pastor Cook, if you stand for a moment, sir. Served in the House of Representatives here in New Hampshire and has been so gracious to allow us to use this space today. Thank you, Pastor Cook, for that. And maybe in closing, I apologize. I should have mentioned you and had you give a blessing when we started, but perhaps in closing, you could send us on our way today, sir. So any questions from the audience?
I understood that with transgender and the escalation of it, that from Karl Marx in the 1920s on queer theory, which he got from Sigmund Freud and worked it out, that it's kind of a form of cultural Marxism. Is that a right assessment of some of this that's going on?
Yeah, so what did Marx actually give us? We hear this word a lot, Marxism. He gave us a worldview of invisible power relationships. That the world as we exist, it doesn't look like the world we see. There's these invisible relationships between us. As Marx said it, it was based on how much money we have. Whether we're part of the economically oppressed, the proletariat, or whether we're part of the bourgeoisie. What happened, and you mix the Sigmund Freud in there, you mix modern critical race theory in there, the modern version of this is we have an invisible relationship to one another, not based on how much money we have, but based on the genetic attributes we inherit on the day we're born. Race, gender, and sexuality. And certain people are oppressed, and certain people are oppressors based on that genetics. Contradictions abound, but let's just take a look at the one as it relates to even sexuality. LGBTQIA, there's so many letters, they just put a little plus at the end. This was the same religion. I'm going to use the word religion. I should call it a cult, because religions have withstood the test of time. This has not. But this quasi-religious cult, on one hand, says that the sex of the person you're attracted to is hardwired on the day you're born. It had to be to count as a civil right. Otherwise, gay rights would not have been civil rights. But that same cult now says that your own gender or sex are completely fluid over the course of your life. So you can't believe these two things at once, right? That sex of the person you're attracted to had to be hardwired on the day you're born, but yet your own biological sex can be completely fluid, especially when one does not have a genetic basis and the other one has an absolute genetic basis. 2 X chromosomes, you're a woman, an X and a Y, you're a man. And so what's actually going on is that it's not grounded in truth. It's grounded in preying on, and this is what we talked about the last time I was here, Pastor, so this was a different topic we had today, but it's all tied up. It's all preying on our deeper hunger for purpose and meaning. This is why Marx was actually an opponent to Christianity, or to the nuclear family for that matter, is that the things that fill that void, like faith, family, patriotism, hard work, these things fill our vacuum for purpose, not just as Americans, as human beings. We need to fill our vacuum of identity. But when those things disappear, family, faith, patriotism, hard work, when these things are gone, that leaves a black hole of a vacuum in its wake. And that is what creates the space for the poison to fill the void. Karl Marx understood that well, but I think the modern cultural Marxists in our country, in some ways, understand it even better. That's the heart of the answer to your question.
Great. Some more questions? I know there are questions in the audience. There we go. We have some over here. Wonderful.
Yeah. It's good to see you again, Vivek.
Good to see you.
Question for you. So I'm here in SAU 16, and we've had 6 kids, 2 graduate from public schools, 4 currently in. And I've been involved in school board on the front lines, but this feels like we're at our kids' soccer game and we're down 10-0 and it's not halftime. Parental rights and what we can actually do is so burdensome, so confusing. You've got laws on a federal level, then you've got state level, and then you've got these RSAs at school board, and people are like, what do I do? Where do I start? The culture is bad, it's tough. And then we talk about gender dysphoria. Those are extremely heavy conversations for anyone to have with their children. So that's the feeling that I think a lot of parents have. What would you do as president specifically with that? Because there's so many layers, it's so complex, and parents just feel overwhelmed. Thank you.
So look, I think that there's a role for everyone to play. I think that there is a trap to fall into, which is to say that the president or the federal government should deliver all the solutions. No. We all have a role to play, but the president does too. So this will require giving you my, but it's a good group to do it, nonetheless. So I'll do it in very brief form, my vision for educational reform in the country. That's, I think, what the president can deliver. So first step, shut down the Department of Education. Second step, use that funding to actually close any underfunded gaps in school choice programs across the country. Third, make it a condition for anyone who's on the receiving end of that money. That's going to be money that every state's going to agree to. It's a lot of money, $90 billion, 1.7 plus billion per state. You have to adopt a few conditions. One is that if you're going to teach it in the school, it's got to be online. I am open to a conversation about cameras in the classroom. If we can have cameras in here, why can't we have cameras in our public schools either? Now we're talking about economic empowerment. Now you have actual transparency. Transparency plus choice. Now how do we actually allow the public schools to compete? Because with that, many parents are going to be opting out of the public schools. What's the number one shackle holding public schools back that don't hold back private schools?
Teachers unions?
Teachers unions. You got it. And so as a condition for getting that money, public employee teachers unions will not exist. Now the public schools can actually compete with the private schools. That's a big part of the oppressive culture that we see in the schools. Now we're really talking. Then we see the conditions for reviving civic education in the country. I'm a staunch proponent for the revival of civic pride and civic education amongst young Americans, but I'm against doing it centrally from the federal government because that'll just become another form of woke indoctrination. But if we're really decentralized, we really have true school choice, true transparency, true mobility for parents on behalf of their children. Public schools are actually competing, unshackled by teachers' unions. Now you have the conditions for civic education to start bottom up, because once you see poison, parents are empowered, both in terms of knowledge and in terms of the financial resources, to take that money with them and go to a different school instead. And so then I don't think we're playing at 10-0 anymore. I think we're playing at 10-10. And then how do you win an even-handed game? It's actually by more of us starting to talk openly again, good things happen. And that's what makes courage contagious in the country. So could have been a 3-hour version of that, but that'll be a 2-minute.
I want to hear the 3-hour version at some point. Not going to lie. I have some thoughts about some of the things that you said, and we've explored some of the issues, and I think there are pros and cons on both sides. So I look forward to a conversation with you about that in the future. Do we have some more questions in the audience?
I believe we have time for one more.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Deshaun, and I was at the Go USA event last Thursday with Kathy Burnett. She spoke briefly about ESG, but I wanted to know exactly what you would do to combat ESG. I watched a documentary on Epoch Times, but I don't think there are any solutions really to fix BlackRock, Vanguard, and all that stuff.
Great question. Near and dear to my heart, actually. So ESG, it's like the corporate America version of what we've been talking about here as it relates to the schools. So what's going on in a nutshell is ESG stands for environmental, social, and governance factors. What that means is your money, retirement accounts on down, are being used to vote in corporate America's boardrooms for woke policies, racial justice programs, climate change emissions caps that most of us don't agree with, and which do not advance our best financial interests. This is a problem. $20 trillion worth just in the hands of the top 3 asset managers, the ones you mentioned, BlackRock, State Street, and Vanguard. That's about as much capital as the US GDP in the hands of just 3 companies. I believe some of these solutions have to be delivered through the market. So before I ran for president, the thing I did most recently was I actually founded an asset management firm called Strive. The goal of Strive was to compete against BlackRock, and I'm proud to say that within 3 months of launching our first fund, Strive crossed over $500 million in assets under management, one of the fastest launches of an asset manager in modern history, showing that there's real demand for alternatives. That being said, a big part of the problem comes from government itself. State pension funds in California and in New York are forcing those asset managers to behave the way they do. And then Biden put the cherry on top. He passed a new rule last year which changed the old regime, which said that your retirement dollars before had to be invested to maximize profit. He changed the rule to say now they can take into account non-profit factors like climate change and racial justice. So that was passed under Biden. The Democrats in the Senate didn't like it. Joe Manchin didn't like it. Kyrsten Sinema didn't like it. Biden's first veto was overriding Congress's decision to override that rule. He overrode that with a veto. So that's now the law of the land. I understand these rules deeply. This is a rule passed under the Department of Labor, so I don't need Congress. Take a pen and strike that through. That's what the government can do. And then it creates the conditions for other companies to stand up like the one I founded, to stand up and start competing against those titans. And what's going on? This is why the moment we live in today is so different than 1980. It's not 1980 anymore. I respect Reagan. He's one of my heroes. But the real threats to liberty today are not just in the form of big government. It is the merger of big government and private power to do through the back door, corporate America's boardrooms, schools across this country, certifying agencies for private schools, something we have to pay attention to too. The Southern Poverty Law Center, to be able to get done through the back door what government could not get done through the front door under the Constitution. That's the real threat to liberty today. And it often shows up in 3-letter acronyms, from DOE to FBI to DEI to ESG. If it sounds boring, it's designed to actually sound boring because they don't want you paying attention to it. So my general rule of thumb is the more boring it sounds, the more we actually have to pay attention because it was designed to sound that way for a reason, and ESG is a case in point of that in action.
So before we close, perhaps Pastor Cook could offer us a blessing quickly, because again, I forgot to do that at the beginning. I'm very sorry. Thank you, sir. And then just, give you an opportunity one last time to let everyone know why you believe that you deserve their vote to be the President of the United States of America. Pastor Cook?
Could we bow our hearts in prayer, please? Our Heavenly Father, we thank you that our nation is truly at a crossroads of discovering truth once again. We're optimistic that you and your providence are working when even we can't see you working, Lord. We have promises from you for the hope of our country from generations back. And Father, we thank you for young people that are rising up. We thank you for leaders, God, and we just ask, Lord, that you would guide them every step of the way, and that truth would prevail, that your truth would be marching on. And we thank you that we would engage with that truth. Give us the courage, as Vivek says, the courage. That's a word that is permanently a part of his DNA, that he's a courageous man. And we thank you. We need courageous leaders now. And we ask, Lord, that we would just imbibe that courage and stand up for what is right, and that you will guide us and help us. And we pray your blessing upon everyone here tonight, those that participated in the panel discussion, and everyone that took the time to come out. May you favor them the rest of this week and the weekend. Pour out your mercy and grace to them. In your awesome name we pray. Amen.
Amen. I want to thank you for welcoming me, Pastor. This is good to come back the second time over. It's a warm welcome here every time. To share with you the vacuum that I see in our country, and the vacuum that I think we can fill together. I said that we've run from something. We need to start running now to something. We've celebrated our diversity and our differences so much that we ended up forgetting, we forgot all of the ways that we are really just the same as Americans, bound by a common set of ideals that set this nation into motion 250 years ago in places not that far from where we are today. And I want you to think about it with me for a second. The thing that makes us different from animals, we're two-legged higher mammals, sure, we're all diverse with different shades of melanin, different genders, walk in a geographic space we call a country, doing what our iPhones tell us to do. That's not what makes us human beings. What makes us human is that we can believe in something bigger than ourselves. We can have convictions. We can be persuaded. We have ideals. That's what separates us from beasts. Well, guess what? America was a nation founded on ideals, more than any nation in human history. And some nations are founded on an ethnicity, or a monarch, or a language, or a religion. America actually was founded on a set of ideals that brought together a diverse, divided, headstrong group of people 2.5 centuries ago. The question for us is, do those ideals still exist? I believe they exist, but we have to work hard to rediscover them. And so I call myself a George Washington America First conservative. What that means is he was the first he was the OG of the America First movement, actually. Avoid foreign entanglements unless they're in the national interest. He was thinking about the moments we live in today long before we were even living in them. To put America first, we have to rediscover what America is. And I'm running for president to restore those ideals. Meritocracy, the pursuit of excellence, free speech, open debate, the rule of law, the idea that the people who we elect to run the government ought to be the ones who actually run the government, not the managerial bureaucracy at the Department of Education or the FBI. That it's us, we the people, who get to decide the way that we sort out our differences. And the thing I'll say in closing is that I know we've talked about some really frightening problems that are not only staring us in the face, staring our kids in the face. That's what moves me. As a parent, I wouldn't be doing this. If I didn't have my 2 sons in the last several years, I'm sure I would just be in the world of business trying to make my narrow change in the way that I was, but not really willing to make the sacrifices needed. Even when I was 22, I wasn't thinking about national service. I was thinking about how do I succeed as a capitalist? When you have kids, something changes. But it's not just the threats they face. I still think that we don't have to be a nation in decline. We're taught to believe that. I've believed that at times. I don't think we have to be ancient Rome. I don't think we have to be ancient Carthage. I think as a nation, and I'm saying this as the young person in this race, I'd be the youngest president ever elected if you put me there. I'm not the only young one. I think as a nation, we are really just a little young. Going through our own version of adolescence. Figuring out who we're going to be when we grow up. And if you join me in seeing it that way as you walk out today, then it kind of makes sense. Right? When you go through adolescence, you go through an identity crisis. You lose your sense of self-confidence. You forget who you are for a time. But we can be stronger on the other side of it once we get to adulthood. All of us did. Some of us will soon. That's the way it works. And so the way I see it today, I genuinely believe it, that we're not in decline. I think we are still, can be at least, we can be in our ascent. On our way to the mountaintop. I don't even think we're at base camp. That's where we are, but it's not going to happen automatically. It's going to happen not because someone comes from the White House, me or anybody else, down from on high to save us. It is going to happen if we're going to be saved. I said it before, I'll say it again. It is going to be because we save ourselves. So if you like what you hear, if you believe in this vision of truth, if you believe in this vision of our country, I'm going to need your help to do it. My colleagues, Josh and Brian and Fred, all from here in New Hampshire, are here in the back. All I'll ask you to do is spread that positive message. It's not false hope. I don't believe in fake hope. I believe in hope grounded in truth. If you want to join us in spreading a message of hope grounded in truth, help us do it here in New Hampshire, because that's where it's going to get started. So thank you all. I appreciate you. God bless you all. God bless your families. God bless our United States. Thank you.
Thank you.
So enjoyable. I learned a lot. I appreciate it. Thank you.